Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Professor Atkinson for his address this morning, which I found really stimulating and interesting. And I'd love to hear proposals like that coming from our Department of Finance and the various people who work very hard in the civil service, in fairness to them, to do good. It's been very stimulating. I also want to thank TASC for the invitation to be here. The theme of the conference, economic inequality and what can be done. It's both timely and critically important. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously observed that the rich are different, and we were reminded of as much recently when the new owners of Cleary's maintained a zen-like silence while the workers were casually dispossessed of their livelihoods with minimum notice. And I think that this was predator financial capitalism working as social vandalism. And it's pertinent to discuss this issue today because not having a job or losing a job is such a root cause of inequality. And this is something that Professor Atkinson has focused on intensively. And in the interview about his book, he made clear we can change things for the better if we truly want to. He said, and this struck me greatly, the failure to change things is partly a failure of imagination. And that's my starting point today. The need for imagination, to think big, because, put simply, you cannot solve big issues with small politics. And inequality is one of those issues, if not the issue. And I hope Professor Atkinson will forgive me if this morning I focus on Ireland. In 2008, Ireland endured the worst economic crisis in the history of the state. It needed a big response, and we now see some significant evidence that a recovery is truly underway, most evident in the dramatic rise in the numbers of people at work and a consequent fall in the numbers of people registered as unemployed, from over 15% down now to 9.8%. That fledgling recovery offers opportunity to those of us who are rooted in social democratic politics. We need a big vision, a vision to secure the recovery, to spread the benefits, and to do so in a fair and a progressive way that raises living standards and lowers inequality. I believe with sufficient imagination, we can build an Ireland of renewed prosperity from the bottom up and the middle out, rather than from the top down. An early American president, Andrew Jackson, once said, "We should measure the health of our society not at its apex, but at its base." The reason I use this quote is that it's contained in an IMF paper, which was just published this week, and which once again exposes the fallacy of trickle-down economics. The paper found that if the income share of the top 20% in a country increases, then economic growth actually declines over the medium term. In other words, to quote the authors themselves, the benefits do not trickle down. By stark contrast, they found an increase in the income share of the bottom 20% of people will fuel higher growth. And this echoes similar findings by the OECD. And it amazes me, after the glut of evidence against it, that anybody still clings to what really is a fairly toxic ideology of trickle-down economics. It greatly heartens me that across the globe there's a groundswell of opinion fighting for a new approach. Here in Ireland, I believe that we have the opportunity to achieve real and lasting change now. But we must have a realistic sense of the base that we're building from. The IMF has recognised Ireland's banking crisis as the most costly in advanced economics since at least the Great Depression. That's to quote them. We're still recovering from it and from the pain that it has caused people. But we have made progress, and we're now entering a new phase of economic growth. As a social democrat, I believe that there can be no social justice without a more equitable economy. Equally, we need to provide a strong economy to be in a position to provide social justice. It's not enough to champion civil rights alone. People's economic rights are just as central as their social rights to living a complete and a fulfilled life where they can actually be participants in their own society. People's economic rights, I just want to perhaps mention a number that I suppose a lot of people here, maybe most people here, could agree on. The right to the best education we can provide, the right to the right to a job with a decent pay and conditions, the right to an affordable and secure home, the right to health care based on need, not wealth, the right to security of income in retirement, and the right to robust protection in law from corporate predators. A progressive vision based on vindicating people's economic rights can and will lower inequality. So the next big battle is to secure the economic rights of working people. And I want to focus on one central element of that battle this morning: jobs, pay, and conditions. Professor Atkinson points out that from the 1980s in many Western countries, and he's mentioned it here this morning, legislation was introduced that favoured profit making over the rights of workers. I think that's what it boils down to, really. No doubt, and this is why former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers recently spoke about the need to empower American workers through increases in the minimum wage or by giving collective bargaining a serious chance. In that context, I think it's notable what has been achieved here. The first thing we did in government, and that I did as a minister, was to increase the minimum wage, to restore the reduction that had been made immediately in the first social welfare bill that I put through the door. We have now established the Low Pay Commission to review the minimum wage on an annual basis, and we will get the first report from the Commission, and much of its structure has been modelled on the UK experience. In the same way, collective bargaining is a vital instrument for progress, and my colleague, Minister Jed Nash, is now bringing the legislation through the Dáil. And let me say, it passed, I think, pretty much all of the committee stage in the Dáil successfully this week. And given the 20 to 30 year battle that some people here have waged to have collective bargaining legislation in this country, particularly people involved in the trade union movement, I think it's going to offer significant opportunities when, as I hope, it will be passed entirely before the summer recess. The legislation will protect workers' rights and conditions and empower them to fight for fair play where employers are not providing it. This week, the IMF said that to tackle inequality, policies in advanced countries should focus on raising human capital and skills and making tax systems more progressive. A progressive tax system the annals of social democracy. Last year, and this was my first budget excuse me, involvement as water as well. I must be conscious of this. Oh, sorry. We reduced tax for low and middle income workers. After so many cuts in workers' incomes, which included actually pay cuts and significant tax rises and levies because of the crisis, we did reduce tax for low and middle income workers. But we did it in a way that the highest gains went to low and middle income workers, people at work. By changing the USC, the Universal Social Charge System, for the highest paid, we ensured that their gains were capped. And that was progressive. And I want to continue that progressive approach in future budgets so that workers on the average wage pay only the standard rate of tax. The higher rate must be for higher earners. And it's not only the headline rate that matters, it really is the actual effective rate, which can be quite a different number altogether. So through a combination of reducing USC and increasing the standard rate threshold, as we did in the last budget, we can get to that point. But this won't and it shouldn't mean a trade-off that will hinder investment in essential public services. I think Professor Atkinson would agree that a lot of the analysis does not capture the impact of investment in public services, particularly on people who may be very poor. In other words, access to education, access to health services, access to housing. The data simply doesn't really tend to capture that. But it's crucial if we are to invest sufficiently in areas like education and health care and provide more equal outcomes. Because we know that for people at the bottom in particular, equality of opportunity is not enough. Outcomes are what are critically important. We've seen a very significant step in the right direction this week with the launch of free GP care for children under 6. And these are important steps in the battle against inequality. So I want to see priority for working people's incomes and rights, priority for universal services, and the preservation of a strong welfare safety net. Of course, positive developments at international level could greatly assist us in that battle. For some time now, policy at European level has been determined, I think, by a fear that redistribution could damage growth. I think, this has been the underlying argument and charge against redistribution, that it will hinder growth, hold us back, make us less competitive. And it's something I think people with an interest in social democracy have to address. I welcome the evidence that now challenges that belief and hope that it will spur change across the European Union. For my part as leader of the Labour Party, my focus is on putting a mix of policies on the government agenda to raise living standards and lower inequality, progressive income and tax policies, upskilling and education, including the fact that in this country we have a remarkable fact that over 50% of people go on to some form of third level education, and very good third level education in almost all cases, but we have very little access to apprenticeships, and we have to really recreate apprenticeship structures in this country. The right to collective bargaining and the fight against zero-hour contracts, and die-hard opposition to social vandalism in all its forms. Thank you.
We'll wait for the microphone.
My name is Donald O'Brien. I
thank you very much for organising this conference and having Professor Atkinson here and the Tánaiste for attending as well. I was very taken with your last graph, the net wealth of the state, and I'm wondering to what extent that includes things like investment in public infrastructure, by which I mean transport, public transport in large urban areas. Well, Dublin is a large urban area in this city, and the extent to which that is good public transport is a means of, let's say, reducing the possibility of inequality because it gives access to jobs. And also then to the Tánaiste, I would like to point out that one of the agencies of your government is currently advocating a investment in public transport on this corridor near where we are, which its own data 3 years ago shows will be inadequate. And in the best traditions of civil service and public service agencies, they have resisted every effort to find out why they changed policy. They said they weren't going to do it 3 years ago, and now they're doing it, and they are resisting every effort under freedom of information and Dáil questions and every other method I can think of as a citizen to change that. And I do think that it will cause inequality in this city and will be a permanent egg on the face of this government if they go ahead with it.
Is it on? But I think, thank you for raising the point about what exactly the government net worth is. And indeed, the example you gave is a good illustration of what is in the assets of the government. It's not the only assets, but clearly infrastructure of that kind is an important part of it, as schools, hospitals, other buildings and so on, are all again part of the infrastructure which the government owns. And I think also your question brought up well, of course, that the return of that investment is something which contributes, as you say quite rightly, to reducing inequality. And I think the same point was made by, I think Joan is easier than trying to pronounce your official title. That would be challenging if I had a proper voice. But Joan was saying quite rightly, again, I think about public services, which I didn't say anything about, and it is often left out of the discussion. But again, that is a very important element, and cuts in public services, which is what we've seen mostly in recent years, is again one of the reasons for increased inequality, which unfortunately doesn't show up too much, but which means a great deal to most people. So yes, that's, I think, definitely very important. The rest I'm afraid I will leave to my colleague.
I have to say, if John gives me the details, I'm not exactly sure precisely what he's talking about. I would have thought in relation to public transport, a critical issue is to get more investment in. And we're currently working on an investment programme to increase and to expand the level of investment into public transport, because I think anybody who lives in Ireland, particularly in the Dublin and the eastern region, will know that with the recovery there are a lot more cars back on the road now, and certainly as a city and as a country we do need to move to public transport. And the critical thing there is under EU and international rules, we have levels of expenditure which we can invest into capital, and the critical thing is to do as much as possible with the capital investment possibilities that are open to us. We're out of the Troika rules, but there are European Union rules, and because our gross debt, and it's interesting about the net worth slide that Professor Atkinson put up, because of course our net debt, when you take into account cash that the state has borrowed, to have a reserve of cash, and for instance holdings, the worth of some of the holdings in the banks, our net debt is now somewhere closer to a country like Belgium, and is significantly below what the gross figure is. So I'll just say that as an aside, but I'd be happy maybe to take it up privately with you, because I'm not in a position to comment on it.
Okay.
name is Deirdre Keneally, and I just want to address one or two matters to the Tánaiste. I very much welcome the Low Pay Commission report, and I'm happy to hear that the legislation went through the Dáil this week, because I think a well-known statistic would not be too much in the arena, that 54% of the population, the working population, according to the SRI, are earning less than €30,000 a year. And the average industrial wage is 37,000. Also, Tánaiste, you referred briefly to the social vandalism that took place this week, which most right-thinking people were appalled by. Now, not to labour it too much, but the corporate predators in this case, I think, should be very, very closely monitored when planning matters raise their heads in the not-too-distant future. These people should not be allowed to get away with this type of behaviour in the year 2015. I mean, workers 100 years ago fought for rights in the same arena, looking down on the street where all this dreadful behaviour took place a week ago. And as Proinsias rightly said, you have your hands full managing our leader, and the other side of the government would be very, very close friends with the wealthy of this nation, and that's where they're perceived to be. So I think as long as you're in there, we should be all very thankful to keep your eye on what may happen in the next while. But congratulations again for the legislation on the Low Pay Commission, and for the raising the minimum wage, and for all the other social matters. I also mentioned about the single parents that the previous speaker, I think this should be monitored and maybe reviewed, and I know it's due to come into place in early July. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
My name is Gregory Meakin, and I'm engaged with the organisation SPARK, which is the organisation working to look at changes to the one-parent family payment. Myself, I've been a researcher on the issue of one-parents, and really I would agree with the Senator there. I actually don't agree that the activation measures are going to improve the situation for non-parents, will make it worse. But my real question is that most of the reports, any of the reports done on this area, have specifically identified that the main barriers to activating parents to work is the lack of childcare and the cost of rents. And I'm interested why it was that the choice that was made was to recognise that, shall we say, the failure of parents themselves to activate rather than to address the barriers to activation. And you had promised that you would not go ahead with the changes unless there was a Scandinavian-style childcare situation in place. And I think this is the critical thing for this country. What we lack is childcare. Any model that we compare Ireland to European countries, we differ because we don't have those childcare models.
First of all, I'm really pleased that people are actually interested now in lone parents, because for a very long time in terms of social policy in Ireland, it was an issue which was there, but which really nobody ever spoke about, except that when somebody like me, and you know, I was educated here in the city centre, I didn't come from a very well-off background, but in recent decades, if I go into a school, you know, the teachers in the school would say to me, but the children here are the children of lone parents. And I actually feel outraged that people would actually take a whole section of the community and decide that they're, if you like, how they're defined is defined as people by their relationship status. And their children, worse still, and their access to opportunity and to advancement and progress ends up being defined by the relationship status of their parent, the parent that they live with, and we don't even talk about the parent perhaps who isn't there. So I actually really welcome the fact that this conversation and this interest and discussion around lone parents. And I would have to say, because a lot of people here are researchers in the area, and I think everybody here means the best. I absolutely accept that. I think what Senator Crockwell was saying, he means absolutely for the best. But the fact is that this state has had a model in relation to people who parent on their own of saying, going back to a terrible inheritance that we had from the up to the 1960s, when Frank Lusky, a leader of the Labour Party, subsequently became one of my predecessors and Proinsias Rossa's predecessors, and brought in a payment for people parenting on their own, called then the unmarried mother's allowance, the deserted wives allowance, and the prisoner's wives allowance. And that gave people on their own, parenting on their own with their children, whom they love dearly and look after so well, an actual income. And believe it or not, the institutions in which children were brought up closed within 10 years of that income being available. And that's been a fantastic development in this country, a wonderful development. But you move forward 40, 50 years later, and what we haven't been able to do, and there's lots of people here but the statistics will show, that the people who are most at risk in Ireland, notwithstanding that we do have a 22-year payment to somebody who's parenting on their own on social welfare, that the outcomes, unfortunately, in terms of poverty for the people parenting on their own and for their children are actually among the worst outcomes. And you yourself and all of the documentation which Spark has produced says that over and over again. And what I have tried to do with respect and with concern, because, you know, I'm really familiar from all my work as a politician with women who come to me in their late 40s and 50s and say, Joan, you know, I'm now, you know, my children are grown up, they've gone away from home, or they may stay at home, and I'm really left only with the option of getting a very, very low paid job, or getting a very poor, maybe part-time job. And what we're trying to do, and you have the information, is that if we can get lone parents to get, for instance, up to 19 hours a week of work, just bear with me, the actual people can actually gain between 50 euros and 140 euros a week, because we have brought in Ireland what in the United Kingdom is done through the tax system, called tax credits, and I've studied the system. I find it a very difficult system. It nearly broke the British revenue system, and we have brought in a payment through the social welfare system called the Family Income Supplement, which in fact gives lone parents, or any parent actually, because I think as a society we should move away from classifying people who rely on any kind of income support from social welfare. We should move away from classifying them purely and simply by their personal relationships, and their children by the relationships of their parent. So what this, and by the way, the amount of funding that's now allocated to Family Income Supplement, which is paid on a weekly basis, which is fixed for at least a year, and which is now much more accessible because of changes we've made in technology. Secondly, we now have a transformation of social welfare offices. And I would invite you, and I'd invite Senator Crockwell, to come down and to see the new social welfare in-trio offices, where what we're doing is a personalised one-on-one service and one-on-one system with an employment officer. And I can tell you, we will actually undertake on a case-by-case, because people are individuals. One of the things that's wrong, and I think Professor Atkinson might agree, has been that the social welfare system has been kind of a very mass system which has not been able to deal with people individually and to support people back into employment, back into education, back into training. And yes, it is a change. We've already, by the way, over the last 2 years, 19,000 people have actually changed over to the new system. And to be honest, and obviously people's details are very private, we have had tremendously positive response to the changes. And in fact, we now have very significant numbers of people who are parenting on their own, but whose income through family income support, on which we're now spending about an extra 150 million a year, has actually improved significantly. Now, this particular conference isn't about this, but I know that people here care about the social welfare system, and I simply want people to look at the gains that people can make, as well as us addressing the difficulties that people may face.
I'm sorry, but we're 25 minutes over the time, and I'm asking Proinsias to just wrap this session up, and your coffee's waiting.
All I want to do is thank both speakers for their time and for their contribution to this debate this morning. I think it's an important debate. I would remind people, of course, that this is a debate about reducing inequality that requires also the delivery of public services. The delivery of public services requires taxation, and we're talking about progressive taxation. So therefore, you know, for this debate to have any realistic chance of becoming reality in terms of policy delivered by parties in government or indeed contesting elections for next year, we have to take account of the fact that you know, proposals. But he did it this way: anybody who's proposing generalised tax reductions across the board are not being honest with you.